Modern.
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 We're prepping for a voyage.
Modern.
The force of an old-fashioned equals whiskey mass times bitters acceleration.
Why don't you make that a double?
Modern bar cart.
What's shaking, cocktail fans? Welcome to episode 148 of the Modern Bar Cart podcast. I'm your host, Modern Bar Cart CEO Eric Kozlik. Thanks for joining me for this third installment of our Art of the Recipe series, where we've been digging deep to learn about the history, craft, and artistry behind the recipes we follow to sustain our bodies and enjoy life. This time around, we've got an interview episode for you, and my goodness, am I excited to share it. I reached out to a really talented Los Angeles-based artist named Ben Turner, who is the creator of Earth No Patio, one of my absolute favorite podcasts. Compared to a lot of podcasts out there, Earth No Patio is weird. In fact, the first time I tuned in, I almost deleted it immediately. You'll hear the full story about why I didn't in just a few minutes. But if I had to summarize Earth No Patio, I'd call it an eclectic mashup of technical food and drink recipes, world music, and soundscapes that has more to do with building a feeling in the listener than it does with telling a linear story or advancing an explicit idea. In the words of our talented audio engineer Samantha Reed, Ben's show is meditative, inspirational, poetic, weird, experimental, mesmerizing. I feel, she says, simultaneously that I don't understand anything, but also like he's explaining something in a way I've intrinsically known my whole life, but never put into words before. I think Sammy is right on with this hot take, and I had a blast picking Ben's brain about how the line between recipes and art becomes kind of blurry when you stop looking at them as sets of ingredients and instructions and instead consider the gravitational forces they exert on so many aspects of our lives. But in the spirit of the recipe, let's take a little pit stop here before the interview and give you the chance to make yourself a drink. This episode's featured cocktail is the Tallulah, a cocktail recently featured on Earth No Patio. It's a modern cocktail, definitely not a classic, but it's basically a mashup of a Jack and Coke and a corn and oil or an old-fashioned. Inspired by the southern tradition of adding salted peanuts to Coca-Cola, the Tallulah cocktail, like sweet tea and shoe-fly pie, somehow gets away with having way more sugar than most drinks with similar profiles, which is certainly part of its charm. To make it, you'll need 2 ounces of bourbon or Tennessee whiskey, 1 ounce of peanut orgeat, which we'll cover in a moment here, and 2 ounces of chilled Coca-Cola. That chilled part is not explicit, but I think it's important to the process. In a rocks glass filled with ice, add your whiskey and orgeat, then stir for about 20 seconds until the outside of the glass fogs with cold. Then you can add your 2 ounces of chilled Coke, give it a final gentle stir for good measure, right? Because the glass is going to be fuller now, so you don't want to just slam it around like you were with just the whiskey and the orgeat. And then finally garnish with crushed salted peanuts. Bam. To make that peanut orgeat, you're going to want to make a simple syrup on the stovetop, a roughly 1-to-1 ratio. If you want to go with more sugar than water, then what you're going to be doing is increasing the bricks of the recipe, so it's going to last longer on the shelf, but that's up to you. You might have to tweak the formulation if you add more sugar, especially since we've got that corn syrupy Coca-Cola involved. So anyway, you're going to make your simple syrup, then add 1 to 2 cups of roasted unsalted peanuts, and 1 teaspoon of orange blossom water, which is a hydrosol. It's pretty easy to pick up. It's actually a very common ingredient to find in Middle Eastern or international markets because it's very frequently used in confections like baklava. So you're going to add your 1 to 2 cups of roasted unsalted peanuts and your orange blossom water. Bring that simple syrup up to just below a boil, and then cut the heat and let it sit for several hours before straining and refrigerating it. It'll last about as long as any other simple syrup in the fridge, and the peanut orgeat, that combination between the kind of earthy, nutty peanuts and the really mellow but beautiful orange blossom water. You know, it adds a lot of body and sophistication to the Tallulah cocktail, which otherwise is just a whiskey and Coke. Later on, we'll hear Ben's reading of this recipe, so you can compare his version with my chaotic one. Turning our attention back to the interview. Some of the topics I discuss with Ben Turner, creator of Earth No Patio, include how Ben's experiences in the art and culinary world led him to this structured yet highly associative experiment of pairing recipes with soundscapes. Why some of the best or most efficient recipes can seem almost boring or banal, but tend to be extremely thoughtful in their structure and sequence. The intuitive process by which Ben selects the recipes he features on Earth No Patio, from bland, unassuming Italian eggplant recipes to Ayurvedic dishes that comment on bile color and bodily excrement. Why Ben views cocktail recipes as punctuation in his podcast, as well as a few thoughts on the wild and funky barscapes he's been playing with in recent episodes. What to drink while chatting with Avante Garde composer and artist John Cage, and much, much more. One thing that Ben doesn't know is that I'd been thinking about reaching out to him for months before this interview happened. His podcast is a real source of both joy and mental space in my life, and I think it perfectly embodies something the philosopher Kant said about a condition that is necessary for art, which is free play of the imagination. To be clear, Earth No Patio ain't for everybody. If you're a hard-nosed news junkie who hates how long my intros are and who recreationally engages in activities like Twitter duels and screaming at people in traffic, then it might not be for you. But if, like me, you enjoy giving your brain a chance to air out and get lost in a lovingly curated alternate reality for a while, then I think you owe it to yourself to give this podcast a try. Every time I tune in, I feel like I'm stepping onto the holodeck on the Starship Enterprise and selecting a random mashup of programs. And I love it. We've got clips from Earth No Patio scattered throughout this episode so you can get a little sample of Ben's work. And we've also got a fun announcement about halfway through that you should keep your ears peeled for. But for now, please sit back, relax, and enjoy this third installment of our Art of the Recipe series, featuring the extremely talented Ben Turner, creator of Earth No Patio. Ben, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for our listeners, can you introduce yourself and explain, basically just in a nutshell, who you are and what you do?
Good question. I'm an artist, and as it pertains to this particular thing, my podcast is Earth No Patio. It's an experimental food-oriented soundscape type of thing, dealing with the recipes and flavors. My history is, as it pertains to food, is I went to college, art school at MICA and the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, and I cooked a lot of dinners throughout college, and then that moved to like a project. It was like a dinner series I did with a couple of friends. We cooked for like farm to table type food for, I guess, like 3 years. And at that point, we were just dealing with food and like learning how to cook and do it proper. I thought, okay, well, I want to take it to the next level. So I moved to San Francisco and tried cooking at a fancy restaurant, which I hated. I mean, I loved cooking, but the pace and the kind of atmosphere around it was much more intense than it's exactly what everybody tells you it is, which was fine. At that time, I loved it, but couldn't do it. And then I moved to LA and I started a project that was similarly like food oriented, and it was a much more experimental dinner series. And at that point, I was just cooking much more experimentally and like with more leaps of faith and like linguistics and less in flavor. And yeah, so it kind of that my history of like working with food led me to make this podcast, which is food based. And I guess, quite poetic in some regards.
Yeah. Let me tell the story about how I came across your podcast, because I think, in at least a manner of speaking, it was very serendipitous. I was just browsing Reddit because obviously I run a podcast. I follow some of the podcasting subreddits, and occasionally, someone will just ask for podcasting recommendations, and I'll just kind of cruise that thread to see if anything there resonates with me. If, a lot of people are into things like true crime podcasts or, like Joe Rogan or some of the bigger like NPR and Gimlet podcasts. And that's not me. I'm I guess more interested in people who pick a lane and just go real deep into that, because that's where I find a lot of gratification in learning about things kind of as I go about my day with podcasts, just kind of casually piping through my ears. And so somebody recommended your podcast on this thread. And so I downloaded the first couple of episodes and I hopped into my car to go to the UPS store and drop off some e-commerce orders from our e-commerce store. And it was raining. There was a lot of traffic. It's not a fun part of DC to drive through. I was looking for a parking spot, so I just didn't have time to pause your podcast because it was a little weird. It was maybe somewhere between silly, whimsical, and like, on the other hand, very serious about the content, because there were these recipes that were being read very tenderly. And then there was sort of world musicscapes going on in the background. So you'd be reading an Indian recipe, and then there would be some kind of like reggaeton music in the background, perhaps, or, that sounds like something that could occur on Earth No Patio. Or there would be some ambient recordings of maybe like a Chinese takeout place in the background.
I often lie awake at nights, worrying about whether I was born to roast. It can be total.
Vale da penha, sempre lotado. Todo sabadão eu tenho que partir. E os amigos, profissão perigo. Chego aqui na cintura e tiver assim. Eu vou pro baile da gaiola. Na intenção de fuder. Tiver de novo, eu já chego sarrando. Do jeito que você gosta. Eu te deixo excitada, te levo pro
And it's just, it was very free flowing, and it was very uncomfortable to me because a lot of the podcasts that I listen to have a very distinct structure. So as somebody with an art background, when I heard this, I was like, oh my God, this like spoken word nonsense. Like, what is this? How can anybody like this? And then after I got about through the first 10 minutes of your first episode, because I couldn't take my eyes off the road, it got really interesting. And I was just like, no, maybe I'll give it another 5 minutes. This is starting to get kind of good here. So that being my first experience, what's your response to that? And I guess to go a little bit more into the structure of your podcast for our listeners, can you just talk a little bit about my impressions and maybe your more specific take on what you do and how it's structured?
I'm glad you had that drive that consumed you, so you couldn't change it, obviously. And that's not at all unintentional. I tried working in cooking, but I'm mostly a sculptor. So after I didn't like kitchens, I went back to like fabricating sculptures for artists and working for myself a lot, and then also listening to podcasts. And part of my annoyance was just podcasts that treat you like you're like an adult baby. And I think it has its time and place. I need that for certain topics and I don't need it for other topics. And this non-linear audio experience was kind of a response to, consuming a lot of audio media. And in the podcast is non-linear. It's fantastical and at times very self-serious. And that's not disingenuous. It's kind of a combination of like being very self-serious and then also completely ridiculous, like completely absurdist, like throwing it all away. So there's waves, and I think you know, it's not all intentional. It's very much like element of chance, and like the organization of it is structured in that regard. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, what you described is probably quite true. It's like, I don't really know what I'm getting into, so I think part of that is what I want to impart to the listeners, not knowing what they're getting into, and then being taken on this sort of strange audio experience. And you can also forget it. I mean, you can put it on and forget that you're listening to it.
Yes, dude. So this drive to the UPS store, and this is perfect that we're getting into this. And I want to return to some of the descriptors that you used, because I love the whole like self-serious thing, but then throw it all away. I think that also might have pushed a very specific button in me. We'll get back to that in a second. So this walk to the UPS store, it's very serendipitous, because when it's nice out, I'll just walk, and it'll take about the same amount of time it takes to drive, except, you know, I drive when it's raining, and that's inconvenient. So once I discovered your podcast, it was one of those things where, okay, I had a small backlog to get through, because you only have roughly 10 episodes, correct?
Yeah, I think there's only 8 right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very skinny.
And so like I downloaded these episodes, and then I found myself rationing them. I was like, like I have to pair this with the right thing. And
that's very flattering.
Well, because it's not just like a big 3-hour long Joe Rogan interview, which is just like, all right, if I'll just put this on as like almost like background noise, just so I don't feel like I'm in the condo by myself or something like that. But for you, I'm like, all right, I've got an Earth No Patio. I got to walk tomorrow, probably. I'm going to, what's the weather looking like? Oh, it's going to be sunny. Oh, that's what I'm listening to on my walk.
Wow,
and
that's great.
And it's like, I just allow myself to just get a little bit lost in it. And so yeah, the relationship between you, me, and the UPS store is a very strange one, just because the walk and the drive time out just perfectly from one of your episodes.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's good to hear. I mean, I came to this a lot when inspiration for a lot of this, like linguistics and the timing, was I was cooking in this kitchen in San Francisco. Actually, you probably know Bar Agricole. This was
Thad Vogler.
Yeah. Well, it was the chef Brandon Jew. It was in like 2012 or something. But they have a lot and a little. I mean, just because that was my main experience with like the professional culinary scene. Very sweet chef, ran a serious kitchen, but I was walking everywhere. I lived in Berkeley, and so I would commute and I would walk, and then I would listen to John Cage's diaries, and I think there's like 6 of them, and they're at an hour-ish, and similar to what you're describing, walking and listening to those was quite a treat and strange. It changed me very, from one moment to the next. You didn't know how you were going to feel, and like you started, mingling it with the real world. So that was a big part of it. And then also cooking in the kitchen and being frustrated with how it ran. I mean, I think it was run well, but just the intensity that people expect from professional chefs, and the kind of menus that I would see in San Francisco, everybody kind of, clamoring to get that one fresh ingredient, and then every menu having that ingredient. And a lot of times you just think like, well, this is so overcomplicated, and but beautiful at the same time. The incredible food scene.
Yeah, I mean, San Francisco is amazing. We had a recent interview with my friend Virginia Miller, who we talked a lot about San Francisco bar and restaurant scene there. So for anybody who is listening to this and wants to go back and revisit that, check out our episode. It's called the Carmen San Diego of food and drink, I think is what I titled it. And that was probably sometime around February this year that dropped. So, but getting back to some of those words that you use, like this self-serious tone, and the fact that you can just kind of at certain moments, almost like it it gets really serious, but then it just kind of self-destructs, or you can kind of throw it all away. It gets so absurd that it's like, okay, well, what was all this seriousness for to begin with? A couple things I think resonate with me about that format. One is that my background is in poetry, and I think when I look at a poem, sometimes I look for very similar things as what you're describing in that podcast. I enjoy poets, at least the modern poets. I really enjoy Robert Frost and Wallace Stevens as modern poets, and both of those writers were very, very good at seeming very serious, but then having this little trickster element of the poem that just kind of turns back on itself. And, you know, are you familiar with like the shape of the Ouroboros, the snake that's in a circle eating its tail?
Yeah.
You know, it kind of symbolizes the beginning and ending of creation all at once, but it's also something that is consuming itself, you know? So in its... there's also this beautiful quote from John Ashbery's Self-Portrait in a Convex Mirror that is something to the effect of, he's describing a wave breaking on a rock, and the correct line here is, like a wave breaking on a rock, giving up its shape in a gesture which expresses that shape. You know, so I think the recipe is one of the most ingenious places to kind of play with this sort of reversal of expectations and this vacillation between intense comfort, but then also the pushing of boundaries, because food does that for us. We have comfort food, and then we have food that is either experimental in form or flavor, or perhaps in presentation, right? There's the famous El Bulli, kind of like sugar balloon by Ferran Adria. So that we live in this world, and I think it's awesome that you have been able to take the form of the recipe, which has a very set form, and then use it to kind of I guess make people think differently about it. So what I guess my big question to like get us into the recipe side of things and the food side of things, and then maybe get into like drink eventually, this being a cocktail podcast, is what do you think makes a good recipe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think in the podcast I use recipes more texturally, so they're less about their content or their efficiency in the kitchen or something. But I read a lot of recipes practically when I'm making dinners or kind of restaurants or projects or something. So I think two sides. I think there's a practical element. I think the best recipes are incredibly organized and banal, almost not as poetic. I think I gravitate towards really simple but straightforward recipes. And I think in a very technical way, I really love when a recipe groups its ingredients when you're mixing them with like the process next to it. That's a very boring part of the recipe, but I think there's some terrible ones out there that don't do that. And then, I mean, as far as cookbooks go, that's like a different thing altogether, because that's where people can express like grand ideas and like concepts around food. So, the gathering of the recipes, I also enjoy. And, the podcast started out as, the idea was to just read these recipes only, and then read them slowly and with strong sentiment, and kind of let that play out. But it's evolved to include like food writing and different types of, I mean, not just food, but like, there's a lot of stuff now. But I think getting to read the more like romantic parts of cookbooks has been a great part of the podcast changing over time.
One of the things I've noticed about the recipes that you do read, right? You say you read them kind of like with feeling. I've noticed that there's something either atypical or special about a lot of the recipes that I hear on your podcast. So for example, like a really weird recipe about like salted fermented eggs or something.
Yeah.
That is just like inherently weird by its process because it's just something so foreign.
Salt preserved eggs with star anise. Yan pidan. Time 5 weeks. Makes 6 eggs. 4 star anise, 6 eggs, 3/4 cup kosher salt, 3 cups cool water. Choose a 3-quart or large clear glass or plastic container with a lid. Place it on a stable surface in a cool, dark place. Put the star anise in the container, then carefully place the whole eggs inside, being careful not to crack.
It's something like a bar.
In a pitcher, combine the salt and water and stir. Gently pour the brine over the eggs to cover them completely. If the eggs
Or then there's like in the first couple episodes, there's Ayurvedic Indian recipes, and they also offer commentary on like the nourishment or kind of health aspects of what that recipe might be good for. Every recipe seems a little bit special. Do you have like any selection criteria for the recipes that make the cut in your episodes?
Yeah, I mean, they have to elicit some type of intensity and feeling or like intention. So that's actually not true. No, there's no criteria. I was just thinking like there was like an Italian eggplant recipe that was just so banal. I just think sometimes it's nice to have an eggplant in the podcast, and it's really not curated as heavily as some of the food writing is. Sometimes I'll choose recipes based on chance, just opening cookbooks, or sometimes it's just truly what I'm cooking. So if I'm reading a lot of Ayurvedic cookbooks, I'll grab some of those. Those recipes were really cool because they had the way they describe the body and the kind of things that you really don't want to think about when you're cooking. They'll describe like the color of your urine or your feces, or like the bile that you produce, and that, I mean, it's also a big part of our process. But those recipes were kind of interesting also because the cookbook that I was reading from is used in a hospital to actually treat people, so it was like a medicinal cookbook as well as, well, I guess every cookbook is in some regard, but that cookbook was made to heal the body, which is a very different function than a lot of cookbooks that I use. Radish is pungent and heating with a pungent vipaka. It is digestive and relieves gas. Medicinal uses: a good food for constipation, hemorrhoids, and heart conditions. Radish has a diuretic action and is useful for kidney stones.
It's fascinating how, like, reading, if you read through enough recipes, I guess, you know, you can start to trace some through lines about, you know, especially if you have some context about where the recipes come from, who wrote them, you know, how they were meant to be used in the collection that was published, perhaps. Like, you can really learn a lot. I realized that I probably should have asked this question right from the get-go, but why the name Earth No Patio for the podcast?
Oh yeah, good question. It was pulled from an old notebook of writing that I had around. I think as a name, it has the same non-specific qualities that I would want from my podcast. So it maybe evokes an image or an idea, but it doesn't really land itself. And I think that kind of spinning that you were maybe talking about earlier is similarly something I want to have in the podcast. So it evokes a lot of images for me, but I think mostly sometimes I think of it as just sounds, like Earth No Patio. Just there's like a nice rhythm to it, and sometimes I literally think of an earth without a patio, and sometimes I just think of the earth. And I mean, it kind of turns over and it doesn't land, which I think is important to the podcast. But the words don't necessarily have direct like connotations that I was trying to pull up. But I guess talking about the earth is a pretty broad, nice place to start.
Yeah. Well, and recipes are, kind of universal. Every culture that has writing and every culture that has food has recipes, so there is certainly a universal aspect to the podcast. And, since we're still kind of thinking about this subject of turning over on itself or, going somewhere, but like not quote unquote landing, like you just said, I kind of think of whether it's a group of ideas or a group of words or a format like the one we're talking about. I think of it almost like an electromagnet in a motor or an engine. The electromagnet kind of is what the polarity keeps flipping over on itself, and that's kind of what produces the motion, right? That's what actually propels the vehicle. So when I think of groups of ideas like that, like right now, one of the things that I'm really interested in is embodiment. The idea of whether you're talking about embodied psychology or just embodiment in general, right? The idea that your brain and your body might not be quite as separate as we've been making them out to be in the mainstream for such a long time. Like that is a set of ideas that anytime I make a little bit of progress on one of them, then I'm like, oh, but wait, now I get to use that little piece of progress and now flip everything else on its head. And it's like this, it's action, it's verb. And to me, one of the cool things about your podcast is that it's so very situated in concrete recipes, right? You're actually dealing with these ingredients. Take 3 large stone crabs, right? Take off the claws. A stone crab with claws is like a very tangible thing. And yet the effect that's produced is very much like a verby effect is all I can describe it to our listeners as.
Then bananas and cream with white sugar. Bananas should be cut, never mashed, and the cream should be thin. Then hard water biscuits with New Zealand butter and Wensleydale cheese.
So yeah, I was very almost tentative coming into this interview, of like trying to describe what you do, because it is not just a podcast. It very much is art that is available to the public in podcast form. And I think I'm just doing a horrible, weird, esoteric job of it right now. But I really want to convey how truly unique your podcast is.
Yeah, it's a very untangible thing to be discussing. But I mean, I'm flattered that you've brought me onto your podcast and asked me to talk about it, because it's a very it's a very strange and weird project to have landed on. I mean, I love it, but I understand its niche quality, so I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, I don't even know where, like, and I'm not bummed about this, but it has a very low listenership, which is fine. I imagined it would just kind of select people who would be exposed to it would then choose, I hate this, I will never listen to it, or I love it, or whatever. But I feel like it would just kind of grow its own audience quite slowly. Even after I'm done recording them, I imagined if people will like it, they will find it somehow. But
yeah. Now, I before we move on, I do want to kind of maybe tease a thing. You and I did some emailing back and forth before this interview, and we were able to maybe get the very early beginnings of an episode together, where I was actually able to create some content for you, a little bit of recipe content, and I flipped that over to you. So if all goes well, we may even be able to cross-publish a cool episode with me as one or two little cameos in there on our channel, so that folks who are listening to this can actually see a little bit of a cooperative episode that we were able to put together here in a time of quarantine. I thought that was it was so fun for me to think about recipes that I could read, and think about specifically how cocktail recipes might be a little different than the actual food recipes that you normally publish. So I had a lot of fun doing it. And I'm really appreciative that you were willing to kind of play with me like that.
Oh yeah, me too. No, I'm excited. It was really nice that you had a Charles Simic poem like towards the end of your readings. Not spoiler alert, if they can find that poem in the future podcast. But yeah, I'm excited. I think it's going to be a really nice addition, different sort of textural input. Yeah, it's going to be great.
So I want to talk a little bit maybe about the difference between food recipes and cocktail recipes, because it's something that I've been thinking about, and it actually kind of ties back to this whether you're talking about the poetry or the language art of it, because I have this theory about the difference between culinary art, for example, and cocktail art. When I think of culinary art, I think of almost like a Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you've got, the essentials at the very bottom. And then as you move up this pyramid of different needs, you get more and more esoteric, right? So the bottom is like literally shelter, oxygen, food. And then the next up is like, clothing, security, family. The next one is like belonging. And as you go up, it gets more and more abstract. I kind of think as food and cocktails in that way. And I read this book called Culinary Artistry. And they actually had like a little pyramid about that, specifically talking about, food from like diner fare all the way up to, like we mentioned earlier, like El Bulli, like these restaurants where you will pay an entire year's salary just to get in the door and have this one couple-hour experience. And to me, cocktails very much sit at the very top of any sort of hierarchy of needs. They're not connected to the base of things. They're not connected to the color of your feces, perhaps in the same way as like a nourishing meal would be. And so in that respect, to me, whenever I look at a cocktail recipe in comparison to a food recipe, I look at something that is almost like a piece of artwork in and of itself, because it's, art has to be for its own sake. That's kind of like what all the great philosophers have said, is art is for its own sake. It's not there to have a specific function for the daily life. So I wonder if that resonates with you, or if you have a different experience with the difference between food and drink recipes.
I think with cocktails, there's a lot of food recipes. The author typically says, this is a outline, learn it, and then explore your own way or process. And with cocktails, it's actually the opposite. It only is a cocktail recipe because, from my perspective, if it's very specific, the moment you change your bitters or you add a different garnish, you've owned. That is the nuance that is the cocktail recipe. And, if I go like 3-1 versus 2-1, that is a totally different drink. If I change the ice, the shaker, whatever. So in a way, it's not fluid. And that's cool. I respect that. But yeah, I think that's the difference to me. Not to say you can't use the same sort of culinary approach. It's just when you come to that like prescription of a recipe, they serve very different functions. And you can take that, cocktail recipe and then change it all you want. That's obviously probably what everyone's doing anyways. But I was just reading a cocktail book about how, any change is a different drink. So, these recipes, the book was like, these recipes are sacred. Like, you change them, they're not mine. Don't use my name on them. Like, don't do anything. I was like, cool.
What book is that, just out of curiosity?
I think it's Jigger, Beaker, and Flask, Around the World with Jigger, Beaker. Do you know this book from the 50s?
No. So it's a vintage one.
No, yeah, it's a vintage book. This is a strange... I'll do a quick quick backstory, but I don't have much experience working with cocktails, or I never had like the drive to do that. But I was living in Germany for a short period, and I got a job as a dishwasher at a cocktail bar, and it was a very strange and beautiful cocktail bar. But the owner, it was like very militaristic, and like I never got to touch a cocktail. It was, the bar is called the Red Bar. It's in Frankfurt. It's amazing. The owner's really specific about everything, and he taught me a lot about how to cultivate the experience. I mean, there was 3 rolls of toilet paper in the bathroom at all times, no more, no less. There was a specific sound of a specific beach playing in the men's room. There's a specific sound of some other soundscape playing in the women's room. Always had the same hand soap. There's some sort of berry hand soap in the men's bathroom, strawberry hand soap in the women's. And then also the cocktails were just incredibly specific and measured with militant precision. And the glasses were like, some of them only had vintage glass, so we only could serve 3 of them at a time. And I wore like slacks and an apron. But long story to say, he became friends, and he collects like vintage cocktail books, and he sends them to me. He buys them on eBay in the States and then sends them to me, and I amass a pile of them, and then he comes and gets the pile. So
that's amazing.
So I get to like peruse these cocktail books, which I never would. I think I have a signed edition of the what's the big cocktail guy that I should know this? I'm clearly
is it Dave Wondrich?
No, it's what's a I won't remember. I'm not
Dale DeGroff, maybe.
No, it's like from the 50s.
We'll put it in the show notes page for folks.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the function of a cocktail is so different. It's an interesting process too, to like play with the flavors and change them. It's much different than cooking, in my opinion.
Well, it's interesting because usually I'm not talking about cooking at all. Usually I'm talking about either spirits on one hand or cocktails on the other hand. Yeah. And so for me, when I think of a spirit, to me, a spirit is almost like a novel from, the golden age of the novel. Like think of like and now I'm blanking on the like a Thomas Hardy novel, like The Return of the Native or Jude the Obscure or something, where it's like really compelling characters and it evolves and there's drama and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. I think of a distilled spirit, especially a barrel aged spirit, something that has spent time in a warehouse being tended by a blender or a cellar master, being tasted every once in a while. I view that as like a narrative because it almost occurs on a timeline. But when I think about cocktails, they to me they are very much poetic because they have more in common to me with like stand-up comedy or poetry or like dance or figure skating, something very embodied because you're actually either shaking or stirring. So to me the cocktail is very poetic in its form and very different from cooking, especially like baking, right? Baking is another one of those things where it seems very narrative driven. You combine all the stuff and then you set it in the oven and you just get to watch it kind of play out. But a cocktail's not like that. A cocktail's a transaction. A cocktail is an act.
Yeah.
And
it dies. Unlike a baked good. Well, they die too, but more slowly. Yeah. The duration is very different. Definitely.
Yeah, you can't just like cut a slice of cocktail.
Yeah, and then serve that. Yeah. Or make a big vat. I guess that's a different cocktail. That's a punch.
It is, yeah. Or that's a really good point because we have so many bars now experimenting with Negronis on draft, large format cocktails. So part of I think the art of that is almost covering up all the stuff you're not doing because you're putting it in a draft, right? So the biggest thing that I tell people when giving advice on large format cocktails is like, yo, you gotta water it down. Like if you're gonna make a Negroni one day and then serve it the next day, you've got to put the 15 to 20% dilution factor in there with it in the fridge so that when it comes out, it's not just like super sweet, super boozy.
Oh, yeah. Because the flavors amplify themselves in strange ways. Yeah, it's a very different process. And the timeline of it is very different. It's a cool perspective on drinks and baking.
Yeah, and I'm kind of curious to see how this episode that we're putting together turns out, because I do want to transition to talk a little bit about some of the barscapes that you've been putting into your episodes, because those have been just incredibly delightful and even weirder. If that's possible, even weirder. So I want to talk about those, but I do think it'll be really cool to see what you put together, because cocktail recipes and food recipes just are so different. Do you have any thoughts about, the way you might handle some drink recipes in your podcast a little bit differently, or has any of the language in those recipes given you ideas about maybe even like what kind of music to pair it with or soundscapes?
Yeah. I feel like cocktails, when I use them in the podcast, they're a punctuation on a particular activity. So in these barscapes that you're talking about, I create like very, for the listeners, I create like very far out, for lack of a better words, narrative, or like these sort of like guided. It's like a guided meditation, but it's a description of a fictional bar, and sometimes the experience that you would be having while you're in the bar. It's incredibly absurd. It's as far out there as I can usually get myself to think, but at times I sprinkle recipes, fictional or real, over the experience. I'd like to describe the menu, the lighting, the sounds.
Sweetbreads grilled, tossed in olive oil, and seared with the cornflake crust, served with a shot of Ardbeg scotch. A trim fennel bulb, braised in an oxtail demi-glaze, served with a citrus fruit leather, candied chestnuts, and chorizo. Apple slices, peanut butter, and clams.
I think it was, I don't remember the name of it, but I know it's like a peanut orgeat with like whiskey and...
Oh, yeah.
I think I've never had that, and but it gives me the ability to play with these types of ideas of drinking something without having to fully explore it physically, and it allows me the leap of faith that I can do that. And with that cocktail recipe, I had this idea of having like a slurry, like a thick, almost disgusting slurry of a beverage, and that I looked up that recipe and I thought, well, that may actually be a great drink, and it sounds terribly disgusting or not disgusting, that's a little exaggerated, but it sounds a little less conventional, like drinking a peanutty slurry.
Wasn't it maybe a take on like a rum and coke or like a whiskey coke?
Yeah, it had another name,
but it had the peanut orgeat. So yeah. I think it maybe even a reference to like, cause so like down south, boiled peanut I feel like in Georgia, boiled peanuts are a thing.
Yeah.
I dated a girl from Georgia, and that was like a really weird thing. I never got to try it because she dumped me 3 days into a 5-day meet the parents visit. But yeah.
I'm looking it up right now.
I think it's like, cause Coke is from Atlanta, and then the boiled peanuts maybe.
It actually, I believe the orgeat is like traditionally a French almond component to the drink, and this cocktail was called a Tallulah, and I don't know the origins of it, but as far as like how it works out in the podcast and plays out. The cocktail recipe is then read at the end of the podcast, and it's maybe just to play on this, to sort of ground some of these strange barscapes in some sense of reality, and to like kind of play with the fictional and the absurd and mingle it with the very real and functional parts of some of these drinks and beverages. But yeah, I think the cocktails definitely punctuate our experiences out and what kind of headspace we get into. And so in that regard, I think the cocktail recipes serve that function. Like, we all have some sort of understanding of how we feel when we consume our gin tonics or old fashions. They're very different kind of feelings when you're out. So using them as some sort of evocative experiential reference is I think how I tend to view it. Or it's not always intentional, but there is some sort of intuitive like understanding of how I'd feel with that drink.
This bar is a death metal, gridded with vertical steel beams. Mirror-finished metal lines the spaces between. Low ceilings and a cool rose light shines from the recesses. Little rosy lasers create sparkly star patterns on the ceiling and the walls. It's sort of Paw Patrol themed.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And there is like very distinct artistic traditions to me that these barscapes make me think of. So first, I think of Martianism, right? Which is this weird poetic movement in like the mid to late 20th century, where you have these poets actually kind of like writing as if, viewing the world for the first time. Sometimes when I think of your barscapes, I think of like, imagine if somebody way slowed down and then narrated like the cantina scene from Star Wars.
Yeah.
It's like it could have some similarities there.
Yeah, for sure.
And it also bears a lot of resemblance to some of the French surrealists. And this also ties back heavily to drink, interestingly enough. These were the poets who were writing at the time when absinthe was at its height, in absinthe culture in France and in French-inspired cities like New Orleans in the United States. These poets like Baudelaire and Rimbaud were writing these incredibly trippy poems, like acid, functionally like reading someone's acid trip or someone's, drunken night on absinthe. And interestingly enough, one of the big influences of the French Surrealist movement was Edgar Allan Poe, who this ties back to your time spent in Baltimore at the art school there. And then also his favorite drink was peach brandy, and he died supposedly drunkenly in a puddle. Edgar Allan Poe is like a huge drinker. So I love that the feeling that these barscapes give me is very much in line with that tradition, that I can cut straight through the 20th century all the way back to Edgar Allan Poe and even beyond, I suppose. So I really like them, and I do appreciate, in hindsight now, like just talking through that Tallulah cocktail with you, I was like, damn, yeah, that is punctuation.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'm glad that feels that way. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of this is also chance, and it's not like I have no goal in this. And I think as a sculptor, putting things together and taking them away is how I approach all of these mediums. So that's very much how this is put together. And I'm glad that this also resonates with you, because like other forms of art, there's that there doesn't always resonate with the viewer. I mean, I'll be interested to see how your listeners feel about it. It could be divisive. Like it's not. I'm very like happy to talk about it, and it's cool that you're putting it out there. So I appreciate it.
I fully expect it to be divisive. I don't really care if some of my listeners don't like it. I hope I know they won't, and I'm good with that. I think I'm so jazzed about it because for me it was a stretching experience that turned into a comfort experience.
I mean, that's the best case scenario. I think being able, just if not to love it, to just stretch in some way, if it pushes you into a different space. It's only 20 minutes. I mean, we consume so much. It's I mean, this is not like some plug. Oh, it's only 20 minutes. You should try it. I just mean, like, it's nice to be pushed out of our space sometimes, and that for me is partially why I got into doing it.
Yeah, for sure. So, this is, I think, a really cool place to just kind of I'll do a quick summary for people and then jump into the lightning round. So, for context, I did a couple of episodes in what I'm calling the Art of the Recipe series. The first episode, we went into kind of the deep past. We talked about the origins of recipes, on the African savannas and on clay tablets in Babylon and then in Rome. And then in the next installment, we kind of talked about the modern recipe, how the recipe was modernized, how it went from the kitchens of kings and queens and nobility down into the kitchens of everyday people and into this strange space called the restaurant. And then, I kind of took that episode right up through the present day with certain phenomena on like the Cooking Network or the Food Network or the Cooking Channel, where now we have these shows that are ostensibly about food and recipes, but for some reason we have the need for these highly staged narratives around them. So like I talked about the Pioneer Woman show, where it's like, all right, well, every recipe has to have some sort of justification because this person's dropping by. It's almost like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It gets mixed with a food show because the special guest somehow dictates what we're making today. But it's all fake. Yeah. So it's talking about like the idea of narrative in food and recipes. So that's kind of where we stand. And the way I'd like for this interview and then hopefully our little crossover episode to work is kind of, it's not the craft. This is now, we're talking about kind of like the recipe as a piece of culture or a piece of cultural art in our time space. So that's been the shape of this series. So if anyone's listening to this episode and is like, what the hell does this have to do with cocktails? So like, well, go and check out the other episodes in this series. It'll make a little bit more sense. Yeah. And yeah, hopefully, if all goes well, we'll be able to do a bonus episode and send some of our listeners over to your feed for a little bit of extra helpings of the Earth No Patio.
Yeah. That sounds great. I'm excited to be turned on to all those podcasts you're putting out.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with folks about the podcast before we jump into the lightning round? But is there anything else that you think people should know, or maybe advice for how to listen to your podcast?
No, I think headphones are probably the best bet. Other than that, headphones are a car. I think the audio quality is important because at times it's just very calculated, and a lot can be lost if you're just listening like through a small speaker or computer speaker. But no, I mean, you've dug into it quite nicely. It's nice to talk about this stuff. I don't typically talk about it. I just do it, which is, it's nice to be kind of digging into the other side of it and how it's perceived. And no, I think we've said, people should just try one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's probably the most abstract thing to listen to if you haven't heard this podcast.
But you know what? It's abstract, but it's delicious. It's what I'd actually recommend to me, actually, and this is actually very, very concrete. If anyone who loves Negronis ever tried their first Negroni and was like, not for me, I think this is kind of a similar experience because, once you get bit by that bug, you'll get it. You'll get bit by the bug and you might not go back and listen to another episode immediately. but you're going to get curious. You're not going to delete it from your feed. You're like, all right, I'm not deleting it yet. But yeah, to me, it's like your first Negroni. That's the way I'll describe it in cocktail terms.
That's a great description.
So you ready for some lightning round questions?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. What is your favorite cocktail? And if you don't have a favorite of all time, what's something that you've been more recently obsessed with?
My standout, maybe not favorite, but a standout cocktail is Smoky Boulevardier. Was the first drink I had at that bar that I worked at in Germany, the Red Bar. And I think because it had a punctuation on everything I had like learned and experienced, that it became like one that comes to mind very quickly. And I don't actually know the ingredients, but I think it's just a swapping of like a smoky scotch for a whiskey or a bourbon of some sort.
For sure, yeah, you could do that with like a nice like a Highland Park Scotch, or even like a Del Maguey Vita Mezcal would be a nice way to get some smoke in there for sure. Yeah, I had something similar this weekend, so I can get behind the smoky. The smoky is good.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, how about cocktail ingredients? If you were a cocktail ingredient, like a single thing that could be used across many different recipes or a few, what would you be and why?
I like this question. I chose a solid ice cube. I think that's kind of my favorite ingredient because it it's like a mixer. It's like a blender. Kind of helps the drink coalesce.
Yeah, and especially in the case of things like a good Negroni on the rocks or an old fashioned, it does allow the drink to continue to evolve, and it lengthens that experience too, which is kind of nice.
Yeah, and you can use it, like you said, to start the drink like cooler, or you can like mix it a little longer to make it a little more, incorporate a little more water. It's also one that like you can't live without. Like there's no real replacement. If you need that solid piece of ice, it's kind of crucial. I've spent many pre-dinner parties trying to source a good ice, and sometimes to no avail. But
yeah. Wow, interesting. Yeah, one of the things that absolutely kills me is that I don't have very much freezer space, so I can't like get like a Playmate cooler and stick it in there and get like a nice clear block of ice that I can carve up. It is a chest freezer is very much aspirational, but in city living, you don't always get one of those. So
you'll have to make a chest freezer bed combination, so you can just
like a captain's chest freezer that pulls out under the bed
from under your bed. Yeah.
I like this. I'm going to see if I can sell my wife on it after we get off this.
Yeah.
All right. Here's the Widowmaker question. Cocktail with anyone, past or present. Who would it be? Where would you go? What would you drink? Just kind of, I suppose, in the style of Earth No Patio, but maybe less abstract. Paint us a picture.
I think maybe it's a little obvious, but John Cage. I'd probably have a drink with John Cage. I don't even know if he drank, but I'd like to drink with the older John Cage. I chose gin tonics, maybe in like the afternoon, at like a small apartment in the Bay Area. I don't know that he lived there. I think he did. I'm kind of like a lazy fan. I like a lot of his stuff, but not all of it.
And this is the gentleman whose journals you were listening to on your walks to Bar Agricole?
Yeah. And I mean, an amazing thinker, and is amazingly poetic. So I think having a conversation with him would be awesome. And, he had hung out with Duchamp, and these are kind of like some of the more flippant artists of our time, which I really appreciate. So yeah, but an old John Cage, I think that would be fun.
Nice.
And I'd be drinking a gin tonic. I don't know what he would be drinking.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I like that flip. I like the use of flippant. Yeah. Because I think cocktail, I feel like flippancy has its place in the cocktail space.
Yeah.
And if you do choose to include any of the the parody cocktail menu stuff that I sent along there was definitely some flippancy in quite a few of those formulations.
yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, John Cage. We'll link to him and some of his work over on the show notes page over at modernbarcart.com/podcast for any of our listeners who might be interested in checking him and his work out a little bit more. So what's a common or traditional cocktail ingredient that you've never tasted and why?
I couldn't think of anything. It's not like pretension. I do try to taste anything I can taste. So, I can't think of anything.
Is there anything weird that you've tasted? So like that's a very specific mindset, right? It's not for everybody. Have you ever been like, all right, sure, I'll try it, and then gotten some real weird feedback from your taste buds?
Yeah. I mean, there's some things, they don't seem so bizarre now, but at the time, like the first time I had natto, I thought, oh, this is psycho, but I really enjoy it now. So it's almost not a staple, but I really enjoy it.
And what is natto? Is that is that the fish?
No, that's just it's like fermented soybeans, Japanese, and then they're like really, really sticky and stringy.
I gotcha.
Trying to think if there's anything else that I've thought like, whoa, crazy. No, I maybe that's the first thing that comes to mind. It was like served with like quail egg and yeah, it was interesting. I mean, at the time it was surprising, but it's very comforting now. I appreciate it. But like kind of like all good flavors, it has like a lot of depth, and you learn to like really appreciate that depth over time.
Yeah, I was actually just listening to a podcast. I don't know if you listen to Cooking Issues with Dave Arnold. It's a very different type of podcast than yours. Perhaps maybe the diametric opposite.
Yeah, I listen to all sorts of different things.
But he just did an interview with a couple of guys who wrote a book on koji, the mold that is used in certain ferments and very often with soy or soybean products. So yeah, I feel like the fermented space is actually something that's going to be coming more and more into the cocktail fold. But it is very foreign to a lot of American palates. So it doesn't surprise me that the fermented soybeans was like one of the things that kind of made you stop and go, whoa.
Yeah. It's cool to think of more of the fermented stuff getting into the cocktails. It's kind of got that like savory quality to it that I don't always experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So kind of along those same lines, do you have any unusual or controversial views or beliefs we can even make it a little bit more general than spirits and cocktails. Maybe we'll call it the cocktail or food or recipe world. Anything that kind of touches what we've been talking about, any unusual or controversial views that you hold?
Yeah, I don't think it's maybe so controversial. I think I'm not as big of a fan of the celebrity chef. I think that all too often happens where we sort of fetishize one restaurant or one type of flavor. And I mean, obviously people do a great job and we should, seek it out. But I think that's something that just irks me a little bit. No, I think otherwise I always appreciate experiencing how people do things differently. So I'm pretty open when it comes to like how food is produced and perceived. But no real controversy.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from on the celebrity chef side of things. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what ends up happening when the bar and restaurant industry gets to reopen again, because, celebrity will only take you so far. And it'll be interesting to see if we get more or less of that, because I could see a possible case for both or either. It could be that like the only places that we have left are the ones that have somebody with a big name attached to it, or it could be that maybe we get a bit of a cleanse from that sort of thing and we get to experience a little bit of new growth, which I think would be kind of exciting in the wake of all that's happened. It would be a good way to get people excited about going out to eat and trying new dishes again, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that the idea of the neighborhood restaurant or neighborhood bar is something that we start to lose as a result of this sort of celebrity status. And it would be cool if there was sort of a return or a flip. But
Totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, new growth would be great after this. It would be cool to have a lot of strange things pop up.
Yeah.
I think that has a lot to, mostly if we could just change the regulatory process, because I think that's what prohibits a lot of like smaller businesses from, and especially in the food industry, because regulations are so strict, it prohibits a lot of people from trying their hand at it. And if, I mean, I don't see this happening in the US, but if we could, change those, then a lot more people would be opening restaurants, no matter how big or small. And that would be awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, and this is something that occurred to me when you said like popping up, right? I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of pop-ups in the next 6 to 10 months. And I think,
that's true.
A cool thing about that might be, right, people are going to be a little bit skeptical of going to a crowded place. So maybe a pop-up that does a good job figuring out spacing between guests could be successful. And then I feel like, especially with pop-ups, one of the nice things is that bars and restaurants that do that don't necessarily have the burden of a lease. And right now, like, landlord relations is a big thing, because landlords need to, go to the grocery store and put food on the table too. So they need to kind of collect rent, even though there's a lot of rent relaxations going on. But the cool thing about pop-ups, and, I've been thinking a lot about like how to support the industry recently. I think a cool way to support the industry when people start opening back up would be to do a deep dive on the pop-ups that are opening up, because there's going to be a lot of vacant space. And I don't think that a lot of that vacant space is just going to automatically have somebody that's signing a 10-year lease on it. So find pop-ups. I'm in DC, you're in LA. We're going to have some cool pop-ups to attend. And I think that might be one of the first, and to be honest, like, coolest ways to vote with your wallet and with your feet. To get to have some say in what your bar and restaurant scene looks like at the other side of this. Yeah,
that's a good point. I think that's already happening to some degree. I feel like I've had friends that are cooking out of their house and kind of providing meals for people as another form of income. And if it can continue to grow, that would be amazing.
For sure. Well, Ben, this has been amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to talk through this. Yeah.
Can you just give our listeners the various ways to find your podcast, and then just any way to connect with you and view the other art that you create? We didn't get to talk a lot about that, but you have some really cool stuff on display.
Oh, thank you. You can find the podcast at earthnopatio.com or any podcast app. Just look for Earth No Patio, I think all separate words. And then you can follow me on Instagram, Benjamin L. Turner, with 3s instead of E's. And then producer at Earth No Patio for email inquiries. But this has been great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So for folks listening, keep your eye out for maybe a little possible collaboration. And please, if you're in the mood for a little change of pace, go ahead and check out Earth No Patio. And thanks for listening to this episode of the Modern Bar Cart Podcast. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, there's 2 big things you can do for us here at Modern Bar Cart. One would be to tell your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy listening to us talk about cocktails. And if they don't download podcasts, they can always stream our episodes on their desktop directly from the show notes page at modernbarcart.com. The other thing you can do to help would be to head on over to iTunes or wherever you download your podcasts and leave us a review. 5 stars are great, but we're more interested in your feedback. And the beauty is, the more reviews we have, the easier it will be for other folks out there to learn about our show. We're trying to start a cocktail revolution here, and by spreading the word, you're helping us fight the good fight. You can always Reach us by emailing podcast@modernbarcart.com if you're looking for cocktail or bartending advice, or if you're a pro who would like to pull up a mic and be interviewed for all to hear. Also, definitely follow us on Instagram and Facebook @modernbarcart for cocktail porn, recipes, and entertaining tips. And keep an eye out for new product releases and special offers, which are happening all the time. We love our listeners, and we really enjoy giving you exclusive discounts and sneak peeks at our latest and greatest cocktail projects. This episode may be over, but for you, the mixological fun and adventures are just beginning, so remember, folks, drink responsibly and experiment boldly. This episode was made possible with editing and production assistance by Samantha Reed, recipe and poetic soundscape insights by Ben Turner, creator of the podcast Earth No Patio, and a little bit of interview magic by yours truly. This has been a Modern Bar Cart production, copyright 2020.